Welcome to a tutorial video on Unity 2D Basics. In this video, I'm going to talk about tile maps and tile collisions. Before I go too far, I want to note that this is actually part 2 of a video series on Unity 2D Basics. In the previous video, Physics and Forces, I set up an initial project here with two game objects, player and floor, and we explored the ways that they can relate to each other through collisions using box colliders and using a rigid body 2D to move the player. If you haven't seen that previous video, I recommend watching it just to get a feel for how I set up this project and a number of concepts I'm going to build in this video. So, moving into this video, we want to talk about tile maps and tile collisions. In the previous video, we said, as I just reviewed, we set up two different game objects, our player and our floor. And when gravity happened, our player game object immediately moves down to the floor. And if I play that, we'll see that happen again. So it immediately moves down, gravity takes effect, and we realized using horizontal or vertical with our speed multiplier, we could move in either direction, creating a very simple platformer effect. So coming out of game mode, the first thing I want to change is our player game object is very small. It's in fact very hard to see down here in the game view. So what I want to do is I want to make this player game object larger. So I'm going to select player from the hierarchy view, and I'm going to change its scale to 2x and 2y. Now once I've done that, we'll notice it's no longer being hidden by the little camera over here, and I could start to change it. So over here in my different tool options, I'm going to select Scale tool, and I'm going to pull it up a little bit and pull it right a little bit. So now we've increased the scale of our player game object, and I'm going to click play. And once it catches back up, we realize it still works the same. We've increased the scale, and we can still move horizontal and vertical based on the speed, but now it corresponds to the size. So we're moving left and right, and when gravity took effect, we immediately moved down, although since it was scaled, we didn't see that as much. So now we have a slightly larger player game object. Well, that's incredibly helpful, and we also know now that we can add new game objects associated with new image data. We talked about sprites in the previous video, and scale, even if it's a really small image. For example, player is only 32 by 32 pixels. Scale that image in different ways to help us design things through Unity by creating basic images, importing those assets, and then working with them within Unity itself. So we have our larger game object, and now we can actually see when the game object moves left and right, and slightly more when gravity takes effect. So I mentioned tile maps and tile collisions are the main theme of this video. So what I want to do is I want to get rid of this floor game object because it's not very helpful. I want to create a much larger level, and I don't want to have to keep scaling this floor game object because I don't want a giant just floor game object. That's not very efficient. And I want to actually style this level in a number of different ways. So if I don't want a giant floor game object, that kind of limits my options. If I don't have a single game object, what I can do then is have multiple game objects. And as I'm moving in that direction, what I want is a tile map. Now a tile map in Unity game terms is exactly what its name implies. It is a map of tiles. Except in Unity it calls it a grid, so it is a grid of tiles. Now what is a tile? Well, a tile is a single game object. Usually a square game object in the case of a grid, and so we then paint onto the grid the tiles we want based on a tile palette. So we have a selection of different things. Squares usually we're painting, we paint into the grid, and then we can paint different ways. This all makes sense as we move through these concepts, but the idea is we want a grid. The grid is going to have tiles, and we're going to use a tile palette, a selection of tiles we want, to then paint onto that grid the different tiles we want, creating multiple game objects but collected within a single game object. So instead of, for example, 60 different game objects within the hierarchy view, we have a tile map which contains all of those game objects and can have settings that enact on all of them instead of having a large collection of them. So to start then, we need to add image data first. In the previous video, I created a player game object first, and then we talked about how it needed something to draw. Sprites need image data to draw. I'm going to go the other way with the tile map and first add the image data, then add the tile map and associate it from there. So to start then, what I want to do is I want to import a new asset. Now I talked in the previous video how we want to keep everything organized within our folders. Our images are in their image folder, our materials are in materials folder, scenes within scenes, scripts within scripts. Everything's carefully organized so we always know where things are. So I'm going to select the image folder and then I'm going to import another asset. In the previous video, I reviewed this again. We go to Assets, Import New Asset, and I've already created what I want to use for this, which is a simple 64 by 32 PNG file. It's got 2 tiles, each one is 32 by 32, and I'm going to import this. So it's under our images, and it's automatically selected within the inspector view. Now in the previous video, when I imported the player image data, I didn't do anything with it and I accepted all of its default values, and that helped us as we were working through things. I'm going to change that now, because by default, Unity assumes that a single image is in fact just a single image. That's not the case now. Now, this is a single image, but it contains multiple image information. It has multiple sprites within it. So what we want to do is we want to tell Unity that's the case, and then we can start to move towards the tile palette. So I've got my tiles imported within my images. I've got it open within the inspector view. Now within sprite mode, it automatically assumed it was single. This is not single, this is multiple. So now I've gone to sprite mode and changed it over to multiple. It also needs to know pixels per unit. How many pixels in the sprite correspond to 1 unit in the world? I'm going to set this to 32 because each unit, each tile is 32 by 32 and its dimensions is 64 by 32, so 232 tiles. So now I'm going to click apply to save those settings. Now, just by itself, this isn't good enough. What we need to do is now edit the sprite within Unity to help it even more better understand what exactly we're talking about. So in sprite mode, we've changed to multiple. Pixels per unit is now 32. And now we're going to go to Sprite Editor. And it's going to open up this image data for us and allow us to slice it in different ways. Now I mentioned that particular word slice because that's the next action we want to take. We want to cut this up into tiles so Unity knows the tiles correspond to different things. So we're going to the slice option, and then we have a number of different things we can choose from. I'm going to go from automatic to grid by cell size because I want to put this in manually. It defaulted to 64, which is not quite what we want. We want 32 by 32. So the pixel size, 32 by 32, this is the grid. Each unit is 32 by 32, and we want to slice. Now, as soon as we did that, notice it highlighted around each different unit within this, each different tile. I'm going to click apply, and notice if I select on those tiles, it gives me the name, its current position within this tile map, and we see this starts at 0, 0 and extends 32 by 32. This starts at 32, 0 and extends to 32 by 32. So okay, these are all set exactly the way we want. We have 2 different tiles within this file. I'm now going to close Sprite Editor, and now all of this is set up correctly. Well, we have all of our image data set up correctly, but now we actually need the tile map itself, because I did this in the reverse that I did in the previous video. Previous video created the player game object, then we imported the file and we associated it. This time I've imported the tiles, handled all of its settings, and now I need the actual tile map. So to create a tile map, similar to creating any other game object, I'm coming over to the hierarchy view. I'm going to click Create, 2D Object, Tile Map. And notice it added a grid to the hierarchy view. And I mentioned that when I was explaining tile maps within Unity. They're in fact part of a grid, and the grid contains the tiles. So if I open the grid, I notice it has a tile map within it. The tile map was automatically added to a grid because it assumes that we need a grid, and we do. It added the grid for us, then added a tile map game object to it. So this is very helpful. So we've got our grid and we've got our tile map. Now it is the slightly more confusing step because it isn't as clear in Unity what we do next. We have our tile map and we have our grid. We have our files, and the files are set up the way we want. What do we do? Well, I mentioned when I was explaining tile maps within Unity, we want to use a tile palette to paint onto the tile map. That's not as obvious about where to go next, but what we do is we pull up the tile palette. It's within Window. So we're going to Window, 2D, Tile Palette. And so now this is our tile palette. We can create a palette which chooses which tiles that we then paint onto the map itself. So notice it says create a new palette in the drop down above, which helpfully gives us instructions about what to do. So we're going to create new palette. I'm going to leave this as the name of new palette for right now. And I'm going to say let it automatically choose the cell size, and I'm going to click create. Now it opened up a new folder, or opened up a new select folder window to allow us to select what folder we want to save our palettes in. Well, we want to keep our project organized. So I'm going to new folder, and I'm going to call this palettes. And I'm going to press enter to save that folder, and then select folder. So we notice if I move this out of the way slightly, we now have a new folder called palettes, which any new palette we create is going to be saved there, which is good because we want everything to be organized. Now notice the new instructions are drag tile, sprite, or sprite texture assets here. So we want to move this slightly so we can see the project view, and we want to drag tiles into this. Once we've done that, it's going to prompt us to where to save these new tiles. Again, I'm going to create a new folder, call this tiles, press enter to save that, and then select that folder. So now we have a new folder within the project view called tiles, which contains this tile information, and we had a new folder called palettes, which contains the new palettes. So finally, we can actually do something with this palette, this tile palette we've created. Now notice active tile map shows us which tile map we're drawing to at any one time. This is particularly important because if we have multiple tile maps, we choose from the tile palette window which one we're painting to. So I want to finally start painting something. So let's review some of these options. Within the tile palette window, the first one allows us to select an area of the grid. If we wanted, for example, to paint multiple things, we could do that. We can move selection with the active brush around, and we can paint with the active brush. I'm going to select that option. Then I'm going to select what tile I want to paint with, which is this one right here. So I've got this one selected, it's highlighted, we're painting with the active brush. Now move over to the scene, and notice that it gives me a preview of what I'm about to paint on the background of the grid. So let's paint some basic walls off this floor right here. So I'm going to paint some tiles. So we've painted these tiles on the grid, which is part of the tile map, or painted to the tile map, which is part of the grid, and we've used a tile palette to do that. Now, whenever we're done with the tile palette, we can just close that window. So now we have tiles as part of our tile map, which is part of our grid, which is part of our larger scene. So let's play to see what happens. Well, we've got our new player game object, moving left and right. What happens if we move into these tiles? Ooh, we just slide right past them. We're not colliding with them. Well, that's not exactly what we want. These are walls, so the walls should probably stop us. So let's come out of play mode and talk about that. So similar to how we added a box collider on the floor in the player, we want to actually add a new collider to the tile map. So we can tell the tile map that it should think about collisions. So we do that similar to how we've done everything else. With the tile map selected, we're coming down to add component, then from its list, scroll down to tile map. Click on that, and then Tilemap Collider 2D. Okay, well, now it also needs a material. And this comes back to materials again and again. We're going to continue to use the same material we've been using throughout this, new physics material 2D. Again, we could create new materials if we wanted to deal with bounciness and friction. And we want to play. Okay, gravity took effect, and now, boom, we run into a wall. And boom, we run into the other wall. Well, that's pretty cool. Now we've got our walls that are tile maps, and those are set up the way we want them. Now, let's actually get rid of the floor now. So I'm going to remove the floor game object. I'm going to select it, right-click, and then delete. So then it removed it from the project. Well, now we need a floor. Because now we want to be able to collide with something so when gravity takes effect, we just don't fall out of the world. So what I'm going to do is this tile map within the grid, I'm going to come over to the inspector view and rename this walls. And press enter. Then within the hierarchy view, I'm going to create 2D object tile map. So now it's added a new tile map to this. This one I'm going to come over and I'm going to rename floor. So now we have two different tile maps within this project. Walls, which define our walls, and floor, which is about to define our floor. So I want to also collide with the floor, so let's go ahead and add component, Tilemap Collider 2D, and then set its material as well. So we have our two different things. Now I want to draw the floor next. So anytime we want to draw tiles, we want to use Tile Map window. Go to Window, 2D, Tile Palette. Now notice we wanted to make sure which active tile map we're drawing to. We don't want walls this time we want floor. And notice it highlighted within the hierarchy view to show us where that's at. Then I'm going to select Paint Active Brush and click the other tile I added to this. This time, we're going to draw that. And notice the background color sort of matches this, so it's a little bit confusing, the edges here. But we've drawn onto this now. And we can close that. And now, when we play, now we're colliding with the floor, which is a different tile map than the walls. Oh no! Our little person's bouncing around. That's not what we want to happen. That's incredibly weird and silly. So what's going on? Well, what it's doing is it's rotating. So on the player game object, we want to select that. Then when you come down to Rigid Body 2D Constraints, and we want to freeze rotation Z. So it does not rotate among its Z axis. And let's play. And now it won't rotate. So now we can move around. And we've got our walls and our floor set up. So let's review everything I've done in this video. This video showed tile maps and tile collisions to get us sort of building a greater project here. The first thing I did though was I talked about what tile maps are within Unity. So tile maps have a grid system, and a tile map is basically a map of tiles or a grid of tiles. When we create a new tile map, it automatically creates a grid for us, then adds a tile map to it. We can change the settings of the tile map within the grid as well, which we didn't do much with in this video. We can also add components to them as we've done in other game objects using the hierarchy view and then an inspector view. But then we saw that in order to use that, we had to draw tiles onto it. We draw tiles using the tile palette. Tile palette is part of Window 2D Tile Palette. Tile palette, however, requires some type of sprite data, some type of image data. I prepared that ahead of time in this video by creating a basic tiles file, went through assets, import new asset, put it in, and then marked it within its sprite mode to multiple instead of the default single, then set its pixel per unit to 32. How many pixels are per unit? 32 in this case. Then I went into the Sprite Editor, and then we went to Slice, and I changed it to grid by cell size, and then I told it what cell size it was. And then which was 32 by 32, we sliced it. I then applied those settings, closed the Sprite Editor. Then I went to Window, 2D, Tile Palette. We created a new palette. We let it go to the default options. Then we drag and dropped the new sprite data into this tile palette. We then created a new folder for palettes, and then a new folder for tiles. And then I made sure I was looking at the active tile map of what I wanted to draw on. I then used the active brush to draw those tiles onto the screen. When I was done, I closed the tile palette. Then we went to the tile map I wanted to collide with and added a component, add component, Tilemap Collider 2D. We set its material. Then we did the same thing for the floor. We got rid of the initial floor game object, which now allows us to use a tile map instead of the initial game object. And we went through similar steps where we added a tile collider 2D by going to add component, Tilemap Collider 2D. We set its material. Then we went to Window, 2D, Tile Palette again. This time we selected floor instead of walls, and we drew what we wanted to the floor. And now we have a more complex level here, where we have certain tile maps that are the wall, a certain tile map that is the wall, and a certain tile map that is the floor. And we can also still move around, and then we went in and we realized that as we're moving around in things, we needed to slightly change the options. So we went in and we froze the rotate Z by going to the player game object within its inspector view, rigid body 2D, constraints, freeze, rotation, Z. So that's everything I've covered in this video, and we're finally moving to a more complex project, building on the concept I introduced in the first video with physics and forces, as we talked about player game objects and their relations to each other through rigid bodies and especially box colliders. Moving to this video, we talked about tile maps, adding to the project, having different tile maps, and wanting to collide them by adding Box Collider 2D to them as part of the add components, as well as start to again build on the complexity of the number of things we have. Now we have images, materials, palettes, scenes, scripts, and tiles all within our project, building towards a more complex Unity 2D Basics project. Thanks for watching.